After my wife Beatrice died, her daughters did not even wait for the grass to grow on her grave before they showed their true colors. They cornered me outside the funeral home, eyes dry and ambitious, and said, "Gus, sign over the house and the bakery business immediately. You were only married 4 years. You are just a glorified tenant." My lawyer urged me to fight them right there in the parking lot, to scream the truth about who really paid for their lifestyles. But I refused. I let them think they had won. I let them drag me to their high-rise office later that week. I sat there looking like a defeated old man, and I signed every single paper they put in front of me. They smiled, clinking their champagne glasses, celebrating their victory over the stepdad they despised. They smiled right until their arrogant lawyer turned pale, dropped the contract, and whispered, "Oh my God, you did not read the addendum." What happened next did not just ruin their day, it ended their financial lives forever. Before I tell you how I destroyed their greed with one sentence, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to ungrateful family members. My name is Augustus Bennett, but everyone calls me Gus. I am 68 years old, a retired architect, and until 3 days ago I was the proud husband of the most wonderful woman in Seattle. But standing there in the relentless Washington drizzle, watching the mahogany casket lower into the wet earth, I felt more like an intruder than a widower. The funeral service had started at 10. Harper and Madison, Beatrice's daughters from her first marriage, arrived 40 minutes late. They stepped out of a black SUV dressed not for a funeral, but for a Fashion Week event. Harper, 34, and a shark in the real estate world, wore oversized sunglasses and a coat that cost more than my truck. Madison, 29, was already holding her phone up, live streaming her tears to her 50,000 followers. I stood by the grave, my hand resting on the cold wood of the casket. I wanted to fix the white lilies that had shifted during the transport. I reached out my fingers, trembling slightly, just wanting to make it perfect for Beatrice one last time. Suddenly, a hand slapped mine away. It was sharp, cold, and violent. I looked up to see Harper glaring at me over the rim of her glasses. "Don't touch her," she hissed, her voice low enough that the pastor could not hear, but loud enough to cut me open. "You have done enough, Gus. Step back and let the real family mourn." I froze. Beatrice had been my wife. I had held her hand through 4 rounds of chemo. I had cleaned up her vomit. I had read to her every night when the morphine stopped working. Harper and Madison had visited exactly twice in 6 months, and both times they stayed for 20 minutes because they had dinner reservations. Yet here I was, being pushed into the second row. Madison pushed past me, angling her phone to get the casket and her tear-stained face in the frame. I heard her whisper to her followers, "It is so hard to say goodbye to my best friend." I clenched my fists in my pockets. I did not say a word. I stepped back into the mud, letting the rain hide the tears of rage mixing with my grief. The service ended quickly. As the few friends and distant relatives began to walk toward their cars, I waited for the girls. Tradition dictated we go to the family house for a reception. I had spent 2 days preparing Beatrice's favorite crab bisque, thinking we could share memories. But Harper did not head toward her car. She marched straight up to me, her heels sinking into the soft grass. Madison was right behind her, typing furiously on her phone. "We need to talk," Harper said. "No hello, no condolences, just business." "Not here, Harper," I said, my voice hoarse from days of silence. "Let's go home. We can eat and talk." Harper laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "That is exactly what we need to discuss, Gus. There is no we going home. Madison and I are listing the house. The Seattle market is peaking right now, and we have a buyer lined up who wants a quick close." I felt like I had been punched in the gut. Listing the house, I asked, my brain struggling to process the cruelty. "We just buried your mother 10 minutes ago. That is my home. I designed that renovation. I built the deck with my own hands." Harper stepped closer, invading my personal space. She smelled of expensive perfume and ruthlessness. Correction, Gus. It was Mom's house. She bought the land before she met you. Her name is on the deed. You are just the second husband. The contract expired the moment her heart stopped. You have 2 weeks to vacate. Madison finally looked up from her phone smirking. Actually, make it 1 week. I need to stage the living room for the listing photos, and your old recliner is hideous. It ruins the aesthetic. I looked at them, really looked at them. I did not see the little girls Beatrice used to talk about with such love. I saw 2 predators smelling blood in the water. They thought I was weak. They thought I was just a retired old man with a pension and a broken heart. They did not know that before I was a gentle husband, I was a man who built skyscrapers and negotiated with unions. I took a deep breath, straightening my spine. We will discuss this later, I said, turning my back on them. I walked to my truck, my legs shaking not from fear, but from the effort of holding back an explosion. I drove my Ford truck through the gray streets of Seattle. The wipers slapped a rhythm against the windshield like a countdown. As I drove, memories flooded back, not of the happy times, but of the sacrifices I had hidden from everyone. 15 years ago, Beatrice was drowning in debt. Her first husband had left her with a failing bakery and 2 daughters in private school. We were not married then. I had just sold my own house, a beautiful mid-century modern. I had restored myself. I took that money, $300,000, and I did not buy a yacht or a sports car. I paid off Beatrice's mortgage. I paid for Harper's real estate license courses. I paid for Madison's marketing degree that she never used. But I never asked Beatrice to put my name on the deed. I trusted her. I loved her. I did not want her to feel like I was buying her affection. I thought we were partners. Now, driving toward the house I had saved, I realized that to her daughters my generosity was not love. It was a weakness to be exploited. I pulled into the driveway. The house stood there, a beautiful craftsman bungalow that I had lovingly restored plank by plank. I walked up the porch steps, the wood groaning familiarly under my boots. I reached into my pocket for my keys. I slid the key into the lock and turned it. It did not move. I frowned, jiggling it. Maybe the rain had warped the wood. I tried again, harder. Nothing. The key did not fit. I stepped back and looked at the hardware. It was shiny new brass. The scratches I had made installing the old lock were gone. My stomach dropped. I rang the doorbell, feeling ridiculous ringing the bell of my own home. The door opened, but the chain was still on. Harper's face appeared in the crack. "Oh, you are here," she said casually, as if she had not just locked me out of my life. "We had to change the locks, Gus. Security reasons. You know how it is with empty houses." "Empty house," I shouted, slamming my hand against the doorframe. "I live here. My clothes are in there. My medication is in there." Harper sighed, the sound of a parent dealing with a toddler. "Relax. We packed a bag for you." She undid the chain, opened the door, and kicked a black garbage bag onto the wet porch. It landed with a wet thud. "Your essentials are in there. You can sleep on the sofa in the living room for tonight, since you have not found a place yet. But do not get comfortable. The master bedroom is off limits. I am using it as an office to process the estate." I looked at the garbage bag. Then I looked past her into the living room. My leather recliner, the one Madison had called hideous, was gone. In its place were staging boxes. I walked in water dripping from my coat onto the hardwood floor I had refinished last summer. Harper wrinkled her nose. "Take your shoes off, Gus. We just had the carpets cleaned. You are tracking mud into my asset." I did not argue. I did not scream. I walked into the living room and sat on the edge of the sofa. It was a beige, uncomfortable thing Beatrice had bought for guests. Now it was my bed. I woke up to the smell of coffee, but it was not the warm, inviting smell of our mornings. It was the smell of a stranger's routine. I walked into the kitchen, my back stiff from the sofa. Harper and Madison were sitting at the island eating avocado toast. They did not offer me any. On the refrigerator right next to a picture of Beatrice and me in Hawaii was a neon yellow sticky note. I walked over and read it. My breath caught in my throat. In Harper's sharp, angular handwriting it read, "Rent schedule for Gus Bennett. Daily rate $100. Weekly rate $500. Payable every Friday via Venmo. Failure to pay will result in immediate eviction." I pulled the note off the fridge. My hand was not shaking anymore. The sadness that had been drowning me for days began to recede, replaced by a cold, hard clarity. I turned to look at them. Harper did not even look up from her iPad. Madison was editing a selfie. "You are charging me rent?" I asked, my voice dangerously calm. "To live in the house I paid for." Harper took a sip of her coffee. "It is standard procedure, Gus. You are not an owner. You are an occupant. Occupants pay rent. That money goes into the estate to pay for the property taxes you probably cannot afford anymore. Be grateful I gave you the family discount." I looked at her, really looked at her. I saw the greed in her eyes, the absolute lack of empathy. And in that moment, the last thread of loyalty I felt toward Beatrice's children snapped. I did not see my wife's daughters anymore. I saw enemies. I crumpled the sticky note in my fist. I did not yell. I did not beg. I simply nodded. "Understood," I said. I turned around and walked out the back door to the detached garage. They had not changed the lock on that yet, probably because they thought it was just full of rusty tools. They were wrong. Inside that garage, hidden behind a stack of plywood, was my old drafting safe. I spun the dial. Left, right, left. The heavy door clicked open. Inside were the documents I had kept for 20 years. Not just the blueprints of the house, but the original loan agreements, the bank transfers, and a document Beatrice and I had signed 10 years ago, a document I had never shown anyone, not even Harper. I took out my phone and dialed a number I hadn't called in years. It rang twice. "Sullivan," I said when the deep voice answered. "It is Gus Bennett. I need you to dust off your suit. We have a war to fight." "What is the situation?" Gus Sullivan asked. He was the kind of lawyer who didn't bill for chit-chat. He billed for blood. "The situation," I said, watching Harper through the kitchen window as she laughed at something on her screen, "is that my stepdaughters just declared war on the wrong architect. They want to play by the technicalities." "Fine. I am ready to activate the nuclear option." As the last black sedan pulled away from the cemetery, leaving tire tracks in the mud, I turned toward my truck. I expected to lead the procession back to the house for the reception. I had spent $500 on catering, ordering the specific crab cakes Beatrice loved, thinking we would sit together and share stories about the woman who had glued us all together. But before I could open my door, Harper stepped in front of me, blocking my path. Her heels clicked on the wet asphalt like a judge striking a gavel. "Cancel the food, Gus," she said, her voice flat and devoid of any lingering sadness. "We are not going back to the house to eat tiny sandwiches and cry. We are going back to start the inventory." I blinked, rain dripping from the brim of my hat. Inventory. "Beatrice has not even been in the ground for an hour. Can we not have one evening of peace?" Harper crossed her arms, her leather gloves creaking. "The market is shifting, Gus. Interest rates are climbing next month. If we list the house by Monday, we can get a cash offer over the asking price. I already have 3 investors lined up who are looking for a teardown in this zip code." I felt the blood drain from my face. A teardown, that is my home. I spent 10 years restoring that place. I hand-sanded those oak floors until my knees bled. I built the custom cabinets in the kitchen because your mother wanted a specific shade of teal. I insulated the attic. That house is not an asset to be flipped. It is my life. Madison chimed in from behind her sister, not looking up from her screen, where she was likely deleting sympathy comments that did not fit her aesthetic. "Actually, we can do whatever we want," she said, popping a piece of gum with a wet snap. Mom did not leave the house to you, Gus. She left her estate to her next of kin. That is us, not you. I looked between them, waiting for the punchline, waiting for them to say they were grieving and not thinking straight, but their eyes were clear and cold. Harper stepped closer, her perfume smelling like expensive gardenias and ruthlessness. Let us be clear about the legal reality here, Gus. Mom bought that bungalow 3 years before you two got married. She never added you to the title. We checked the county records this morning before the service. The world spun. It was true. Beatrice had bought the house as a fixer-upper before we wed. When I sold my own condo to pay for the renovations, I never asked her to put my name on the deed. I thought marriage was the ultimate contract. I thought trust was stronger than ink. I was a fool. I paid for the roof last winter. I stammered, my voice sounding weak even to my own ears. I paid the property taxes for the last decade. That has to count for something. Harper laughed, a dry sound that grated against my nerves. That counts as rent, Gus. You were living there, were not you? You were paying for the privilege of sleeping under my mother's roof. And now that she is gone, your lease is up. Legally, you are a tenant at sufferance. And as the executors of the estate, we are terminating your tenancy. Madison finally looked up, a cruel smirk playing on her lips. You should be grateful we are not charging you back pay for the last month. You have 2 weeks to get your junk out before the stagers arrive. If you leave anything behind, we are billing you for the removal fees. Harper checked her watch, dismissing me like a fired employee who had lingered too long in the lobby. 2 weeks is generous, Gus. Don't make us get a sheriff to enforce it. We are doing this for Mom's legacy. She would not want her prime assets wasting away with a retired old man living in them. We need to liquidate. They turned and walked toward their luxury SUV, their heels avoiding the puddles, leaving me standing alone in the cold drizzle. I looked at my hands, the rough, calloused hands that had built the deck they were about to sell, the hands that had cared for their mother when she could not walk. I realized then that my grief was a luxury I could no longer afford. I was not just a widower mourning his wife. I was a man about to be homeless, erased from the life I had built by the very people I had supported. I got into my truck and gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. They thought they held the deed. They thought they held all the power. But they had forgotten who actually knew where the bodies were buried, and more importantly, who knew how the foundation of that house was truly built. I merged onto the interstate, the engine of my old Ford rumbling a low protest against the slick pavement. The wipers beat a hypnotic rhythm back and forth like a pendulum, counting down the minutes of my life that were no longer mine. Every mile closer to the house felt like driving into a fog. I passed the exit for downtown, and my gaze drifted to the skyline, specifically to the glass tower of First National Bank. That building held the ghost of my biggest mistake. 15 years ago, I sat in a sterile office on the 20th floor of that very building. Beatrice was sitting next to me, her hands shaking so hard she spilled her lukewarm water. She was 45, then beautiful but terrified. The bakery was 3 months behind on rent. The private school tuition for Harper and Madison schools they absolutely had to attend to maintain their social standing was overdue. The bank was threatening foreclosure on the bungalow. She was drowning, and I was the only life raft. I did not hesitate. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a cashier's check. $350,000. It was the entire proceeds from the sale of my own home, a sleek condo in Queen Anne that I had designed myself. It was my retirement. It was my safety net. I slid it across the mahogany desk to the loan officer. Beatrice grabbed my arm, her eyes wide with tears. "Gus," she whispered, "you cannot do this. That is everything you have. We need to go to a lawyer. We need to put your name on the deed to the house. We need to make this a partnership." I looked at her, really looked at her, and I made the decision that would leave me homeless a decade later. No, I told her. If we put my name on the deed now, the girls will think I bought my way into this family. They will think I am trying to replace their father with a checkbook. I want to be your husband, Bay, not your landlord. Keep the house in your name. Just promise me we are in this together. She promised. She kissed me right there in front of the banker and swore I would never regret it. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles white against the worn leather. I did not regret saving her. I did not regret the years of stability that money bought. But I regretted thinking that honor was a currency that Harper and Madison would accept. To them, my sacrifice was not a gift. It was invisible ink. They drove cars paid for by that check. They went to colleges paid for by the profits of the bakery I saved. And now they were using the very house I rescued to erase me. I pulled into the driveway. The rain had slowed to a mist. The house stood there warm and inviting, the yellow porch light glowing against the gray afternoon. It looked exactly like the home I had left 4 hours ago, yet it felt alien. I parked the truck and walked up the steps, the heavy feeling in my gut turning into a sharp stone. I reached into my pocket for my keychain, the one with the little silver house charm Beatrice had given me for our first anniversary. I slid the key into the deadbolt. It went in halfway and stopped. I frowned, jiggling it. Sometimes the old brass stuck when the weather turned cold. I pushed harder. Nothing. It hit a solid wall of metal. I pulled it out and looked at the key, then at the lock. It was shiny, new. The scratches around the plate, the ones I made when I installed the hardware 5 years ago, were gone. I tried the handle. Locked. I peered through the glass pane. Inside, I could see my raincoat hanging on the rack where I left it. I could see the mail on the table. But I could not get to them. My key, the symbol of my place in this world, was now just a useless piece of jagged metal. They had not just evicted me. They had erased my access before I even had a chance to say goodbye. The deadbolt clicked from the inside, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the quiet afternoon. The door swung open, revealing Harper. She was not holding a welcome mat. She was holding a black, heavy-duty contractor bag, the kind used for construction debris. Before I could speak, she heaved it forward. The bag landed with a wet, sickening thud on the porch, splashing rainwater onto my boots. It slid a few inches and came to rest in a puddle. "There are your essentials," Harper said, wiping her hands on her designer jeans as if she had just touched something filthy. "We packed your toiletries, your pajamas, and your medications. Everything else stays inside until the estate inventory is complete. We cannot risk you removing valuable assets before they are appraised." Valuable assets. I repeated, my voice tight. "Harper, those are my shirts. That is my blood pressure medication. You threw my life into a puddle." I stepped forward, intending to march past her and go straight to the bedroom I had shared with her mother for 4 years. I wanted to close the door and sleep for a week. But Harper did not move. She stood in the doorway, blocking the path to the stairs. "Where do you think you are going?" she asked, her eyebrow arching. "To my room," I said. "To sleep." Harper let out a short, sharp laugh. "That is not your room anymore, Gus. The master suite is off limits. I have set up my laptops and files in there. It is now the command center for the estate liquidation. I need the space to organize the deeds, the jewelry, and the accounts. You can sleep in the living room." I looked past her. Madison was already in the living room, lounging on the beige guest sofa, her feet propped up on the coffee table I had built from reclaimed barnwood. She was scrolling through her phone, completely ignoring the fact that she was occupying the space of the man who paid the heating bill. "You want me to sleep on the sofa?" I asked, the humiliation burning my throat like acid. "In my own house," Harper shrugged. "It is a perfectly good sofa, Gus. Mom bought it last year. Besides, it is only for a few days. Once you find a new place, you won't have to worry about it. Now, are you coming in, or are you going to stand there letting the cold air in? The heating bill is expensive enough as it is." I picked up the wet garbage bag from the porch. It felt heavy and cold, a dead weight in my hands. I stepped over the threshold, entering the house that smelled of lemon polish and betrayal. Harper closed the door behind me and immediately locked it, pocketing the key. I walked into the living room. Madison didn't move her feet. She didn't even look up. I dropped the bag in the corner and sat on the edge of the sofa, the cushion stiff and unwelcoming. This was the furniture we saved for guests, for strangers. Now I was the stranger. I heard Harper go upstairs. I heard the door to the master bedroom click shut. The lock turned. She was in my sanctuary, going through my wife's jewelry box, calculating the value of our memories. I lay down on the sofa, keeping my boots on because I didn't want to give them the satisfaction of seeing me get comfortable. I stared up at the ceiling. I traced the lines of the tongue and groove pine planks I had installed myself 3 summers ago. I remembered the sweat, the sawdust in my eyes, and Beatrice standing on the ladder holding the nail gun laughing, because she was afraid of heights, but wanted to help. That ceiling was a labor of love. Now it was just a roof over the head of a man who had nothing. I closed my eyes, fighting back the hot sting of tears. I would not cry for them. I would not let them hear me break. I swallowed the grief, pushing it down until it turned into something hard and cold in the pit of my stomach. They had taken my bed. They had taken my dignity. But they had forgotten that I built this ceiling. I knew exactly how much weight it could hold before it collapsed, and I knew exactly which beam to pull to bring the whole structure down on top of them. I woke up to the sound of a blender whirring in the kitchen. My neck was stiff, a sharp pain radiating down my spine from sleeping curled up on the short beige sofa. For a second, just a split second, I forgot where I was. I thought I was back in my bed, Beatrice beside me, the smell of her morning toast wafting up the stairs. Then reality crashed down. I was in the living room. Beatrice was gone, and I was an intruder in the home I had built. I sat up, rubbing my face. I needed coffee. I walked into the kitchen, my socks sliding on the hardwood floors I had installed. Harper and Madison were sitting at the quartz island, drinking green smoothies. They didn't look up. They didn't say good morning. It was as if I were a ghost, or worse, a piece of furniture that had been moved into the wrong room. I reached for the coffee pot. It was empty. A single drop of dark liquid sizzled on the hot plate. They hadn't left me a drop. I turned to the refrigerator to get the milk for my cereal, and that is when I saw it. A neon yellow sticky note stuck right in the middle of the stainless steel door, covering the photo of Beatrice and me in Hawaii. I leaned in, squinting to read Harper's sharp, angular handwriting. The words hit me like a slap in the face. Rental agreement for Gus Bennett. Monthly rate $2,000. Due date every Friday by 5 p.m. Payment method: Venmo or cashier's check only. Failure to pay will result in immediate eviction notices being filed with the county sheriff. I pulled the note off the cold metal. My hand wasn't shaking. It was steady, stone-cold steady. $2,000, I asked, my voice raspy from sleep. To live on a sofa. Harper finally looked up from her phone, her expression bored. It is fair market value for this zip code, Gus. Actually, it is a steal. A room in a house like this would go for $3,000 on Airbnb. We are giving you the family discount. But don't expect maid service. Madison giggled, a cruel, high-pitched sound. And keep your stuff out of the common areas. We have a photographer coming Monday. We don't want your old coats ruining the vibe. I looked at them. Really looked at them. For years I had made excuses for their selfishness. I told myself they were grieving. They were young, they were just finding their way. But looking at them now, sipping their smoothies in the kitchen I designed, demanding rent from the man who paid off their student loans, I realized the truth. There was no grief here. There was no confusion. There was only rot. The kindness I had hoped to find, the faint echo of Beatrice's love in her children, did not exist. It had died with her. I didn't argue. I didn't crumple the note. I folded it neatly and put it in my pocket. It wasn't a bill. It was evidence. Understood, I said quietly. I turned and walked out the back door, stepping into the cool morning air. I walked to the detached garage, the one place they hadn't raided yet. I pulled my phone from my pocket and dialed a number I hadn't called in years. It rang twice. "Sullivan," I said, when the deep, gravelly voice answered. "It is Gus Bennett," Gus Sullivan said, sounding surprised. "I heard about Beatrice. I am sorry." "Save it," I said, staring back at the house where Harper was likely calculating how much she could sell my toaster for. "I need you to dust off your suit, Sullivan. And I need you to open the safe. We have a war to fight." "What did they do?" Gus Sullivan asked, his tone shifting from condolence to combat. "They crossed the line," I said. "They want to play landlord fine. I'm about to show them who actually owns the ground they are standing on." I parked my truck in the loading zone behind the bee's knees, a spot I had used every morning for 12 years. Usually the scent of proofing yeast and caramelized sugar drifting from the vents was enough to lower my blood pressure. But today, seeing Harper's sleek black Porsche blocking the delivery bay, my stomach turned to knots. I did not go through the front. I went through the kitchen entrance, the heavy steel door swinging open to reveal a scene that made my blood boil. The kitchen, typically a symphony of coordinated movement and quiet concentration, was frozen. My baker's men and women I had trained myself were standing against the stainless steel prep tables, looking terrified. In the center of the room, Madison was holding her phone up, filming the workspace, while Harper was screaming at Sarah, our general manager, and my right hand for over a decade. "I want the safe combination and the admin passwords for the payroll system. Now!" Harper shouted, her voice echoing off the tiled walls. "We are auditing this entire operation. I have seen the preliminary numbers, and the overhead is ridiculous. We are bleeding money on premium ingredients when we should be buying bulk." Sarah, bless her heart, stood her ground, though I could see her hands shaking. Mrs. Bennett always insisted on quality, Harper. And Gus manages the finances. I cannot give you access without his authorization. Harper laughed, a sound devoid of any humor. "Gus is a retired architect, Sarah. He is not the owner. My mother was the owner. And as of her death, the operating company belongs to us. Gus is just a consultant whose contract has just been terminated." I stepped forward, my boots heavy on the non-slip mats. "That is enough, Harper," I said, my voice low and steady. "Stop terrorizing the staff. If you have questions about the business, ask me." Harper spun around, her eyes narrowing. "Oh, good. You are here. Maybe you can explain to your loyal minion that there is a new chain of command." She gestured to the kitchen around her, as if she were a queen surveying a conquered kingdom. "Mom left the bee's knees to Madison and me. We are the majority shareholders of the operating entity. That means we make the decisions, and our first decision is to cut the dead weight." She turned back to Sarah, who looked at me with pleading eyes, waiting for me to fix it, just like I had fixed the ovens and the plumbing and the zoning issues for years. But I couldn't. Fixing it right then would mean revealing my hand too early. I had to let them dig the hole deeper. Harper took a step towards Sarah, invading her personal space. "You refused a direct order from the ownership," Harper said coldly. "That is insubordination. Pack your things, Sarah. You are fired, effective immediately." "No," I shouted, stepping between them. "You cannot do that. Sarah runs this place. She knows every vendor, every recipe adjustment." Harper smirked, crossing her arms. "Actually, I can. I am the executor and the heir. I can fire anyone I want. And if you have a problem with that, Gus, you can leave too. In fact, why don't you? You are disrupting productivity." Sarah burst into tears, covering her mouth with her hand. I put a hand on her shoulder, feeling the weight of my own powerlessness. "I am so sorry, Sarah," I whispered. "Go home. I will make this right." I promise." Sarah ran out the back door, her sobs fading into the alley. I looked at Harper and Madison. Madison was typing on her phone, probably updating her status to Boss Babe. Harper was staring at me with a look of pure triumph. She had not just fired an employee. She had severed my arm. She had humiliated me in the sanctuary I built. "Get out," Gus Harper said, turning back to the terrified bakers. "Unless you want to be next," when I turned and walked out, the sound of Harper barking orders fading behind me. They thought they had just taken control of an empire. They didn't realize they had just fired the only person who knew how to keep the ship from sinking. They had taken the wheel, but they had no idea I owned the ocean. The air in the cramped back office was stifling, smelling of old paper and stale coffee. Madison stood over Mr. Henderson, our bookkeeper of 10 years, tapping her acrylic nails against the cold steel of the floor safe. "Open it," she commanded, her voice shrill with impatience. "Stop stalling, or you will be walking out the door right behind Sarah." Henderson looked at me, sweat beading on his bald head. He knew the protocol. Only Beatrice and I had the authority to open that safe. It held the cash drops, yes, but more importantly, it held the heart of the business. I leaned against the doorframe, my face a mask of defeat. "Go ahead, Jim," I said softly. "Do as they say. They are the heirs." Madison smirked at me, a look of pure, unadulterated triumph. Finally, she spat. "You are learning your place, Gus." The tumbler clicked, a heavy mechanical sound that echoed in the silence. The door swung open. Madison did not reach for the canvas bags of cash. She reached for the thick, black binders labeled year-end financials. She threw them onto the desk in front of Harper, flipping the pages frantically until she hit the profit and loss statements. Her eyes went wide. She gasped, a sound of genuine shock. "Harper, look at this. Look at the bottom line." Harper grabbed the binder, her eyes scanning the columns. She licked her lips, a predator sensing a kill. 2.1 million, she whispered. Gross revenue was over $2 million last year. And Mom was complaining about the cost of my wedding venue. She was sitting on a gold mine. They looked at each other, and I saw the calculation happening in real time. They were not seeing flour yeast or the 12-hour days I put in to build that number. They were seeing luxury cars. They were seeing penthouse apartments in downtown Seattle. They were seeing a lifetime of leisure funded by my sweat. Madison reached back into the safe and pulled out a worn leather-bound notebook. It was stained with butter and chocolate, the spine cracked from years of use. My stomach tightened. That was my personal recipe book. It contained the ratios for the sourdough starter I had cultivated for 20 years. It held the secret to the almond croissants that had won us the city's Best Bakery Award 3 years running. "That is personal," I said, stepping forward instinctively. "That is my handwriting. It is not part of the company assets." Harper snatched the book from Madison's hand, clutching it like a weapon. "Wrong, Gus. This is the intellectual property of the bee's knees. These are the trade secrets. Without this book, the business is just an empty kitchen. Since we own the business, we own the secrets." She looked at me with a pitying sneer, tapping the cover of my life's work. "You just wrote down the ingredients, Gus. You are just the baker. You are the hired help. We are the owners of the intellectual property now. We can franchise this. We can sell a cookbook. We can fire you and hire a kid out of culinary school to follow these instructions for $15 an hour." I stopped. I forced my hands to unclench. I looked at the book in her hands, the book I had copyrighted in my own name 5 years before I even met Beatrice. I looked at the financial reports for a company that operated on a lease I controlled. "You are right, Harper," I said, forcing my voice to sound hollow. "I am just the baker." I turned and walked away, leaving them to drool over the millions they thought they had just secured. I felt a cold, dark laughter bubbling up in my chest. They thought they owned the intellectual property. They did not realize they were holding a book they had no legal right to open, standing in a building they had no right to occupy, planning to spend money that was about to vanish into thin air. They called me a baker. They forgot that a baker knows exactly how long to let the pressure build before the dough rises, and they were about to get burned. I pulled into the driveway at 3 in the afternoon, my head pounding from the scene at the bakery. I just wanted to lie down on the uncomfortable beige sofa that was now my bed and close my eyes. But as I opened the front door, I heard a voice echoing from the living room. It was Madison, high-pitched and performative, the voice she used for her online audience. "Hey guys, welcome back to the Estate Clean-Out series," she chirped. "Today we are digging through some serious boomer trash. You will not believe the junk we found in the garage. But one man's trash is another hipster's treasure. Right, let is start the bidding at $50 for this box of dusty old records." My heart stopped. I dropped my keys and ran into the living room. Madison was standing in front of a ring light she had set up on my coffee table. Spread out on the floor were my vinyl albums, my original pressing of Miles Davis. The Coltrane album Beatrice and I listened to on our first date. And in her hand, she was dangling my vintage Omega Seamaster, the watch my father gave me when I graduated architecture school 40 years ago. She was holding it by the strap, swinging it carelessly like a cheap toy. "Look at this scratchy old thing," she laughed into her phone screen. "It probably does not even keep time, but it looks vintage chic." Do I hear 100? A red haze clouded my vision. That watch was not an asset. It was the only thing I had left of my father. Those records were the soundtrack of my life with her mother. "Put it down," I roared, my voice shaking the walls. Madison jumped, but she did not stop filming. She turned the camera toward me, a cruel grin spreading across her face. "Oh, look, guys, the angry tenant is home. Say hi to Gus, the hoarder who tried to keep all this gold for himself." I stepped forward, my hands trembling. "Madison, that is not yours to sell. That is my personal property. It was not in the will." "Give it to me." She laughed, backing away, holding the watch out of my reach. "Everything in this house is part of the estate, Gus. Mom did not itemize your little toys. Possession is 9/10 of the law, right? And right now I possess it. I have a bid for $200. Going once. I did not think. I lunged. I was not trying to hurt her. I just wanted to stop the violation. I reached out and snatched the phone from her hand to cut the feed. The moment my fingers touched the phone, Madison threw herself backward. It was a performance worthy of an Academy Award. She flung her arms up, let out a piercing scream, and crashed onto the sofa, knocking over the ring light with a loud crash. "Help!" she screamed at the ceiling, though no one else was there. He hit me. Oh my God, he pushed me. My back. I stood there, the phone in my hand, still broadcasting the ceiling, frozen in horror. She was looking at me, her eyes dry and calculating, a smirk playing on her lips, while she screamed in agony for an invisible audience. I realized with a sick feeling in my stomach that she was not just selling my watch. She was selling a narrative. And I had just walked right into the trap. Madison scrambled backward on the sofa, pressing herself into the cushions with a theatrical gasp as she dialed 3 numbers on her phone. Her eyes locked onto mine, gleaming with a terrifying mix of malice and triumph. 911, please help, she screamed into the receiver, her voice cracking perfectly. "My stepfather is attacking me. He just threw me across the room. I think my back is broken. Please hurry, he is standing right over me." I stood frozen, my hands raised in a gesture of surrender that no one was there to see. The sheer audacity of the lie paralyzed me for a moment. Harper came running down the stairs, not asking what happened, but immediately joining the performance. "Oh my God, Madison!" she shrieked, kneeling beside her sister. "Get away from her, Gus! You are a monster!" Sirens wailed in the distance almost immediately. I realized they must have been patrolling the neighborhood. Within minutes, heavy pounding shook the front door. Harper ran to open it, sobbing. "He is in the living room," she cried, pointing a trembling finger at me. "Please, he is violent." 2 officers burst into the room, hands hovering over their holsters. "Step back, sir," the taller officer shouted, his voice booming in the small space. "Turn around and place your hands behind your head. Now." I looked at them. They did not see a retired architect in a cardigan. They saw the narrative Madison had sold them, a dangerous, angry old man standing over a crying young woman. I slowly turned around, interlacing my fingers behind my head. The officer grabbed my wrist, twisting it painfully, and pushed me against the wall. The cold steel of handcuffs brushed against my skin. "Officer, wait," I said, forcing my voice to remain calm, despite the adrenaline flooding my veins. "Before you arrest me, you need to look at the bookshelf." The officer paused, one cuff already clicking around my left wrist. "Stop talking, sir." "I am not resisting," I said clearly. "But I installed a security camera on the 3rd shelf of the bookcase yesterday after my keys were stolen. It records audio and video to the cloud. If you take me in, you are arresting an innocent man, and I will sue the department for false imprisonment." The room went deathly silent. Madison's sobbing cut off as if someone had pulled a plug. Harper's head snapped toward the bookshelf. Tucked between a vintage globe and a stack of architecture journals, the tiny black lens of the camera blinked a steady blue light. The officer released my arm but kept his hand on my shoulder. "Is that true?" he asked, looking at Harper. I did not know there was a camera." Harper stammered, her face draining of color. I pulled my phone from my pocket with my free hand. "I can show you the footage right now," I said. I opened the app and played the clip. The officer leaned in. On the small screen, he watched Madison dangle. My watch watched me grab the phone and then watched Madison throw herself backward onto the couch without me laying a finger on her. He watched the ring light crash. He heard her fake screams. He watched it twice. Then he looked up at Madison, his expression shifting from concern to disgust. "Ma'am, filing a false police report is a crime," he said coldly. I tripped. Madison stuttered, sitting up miraculously fast for someone with a broken back. I was scared. I got confused. The officer shook his head. He unlocked the cuff on my wrist. "Mr. Bennett, you are free to go. We are writing this up as a domestic disturbance, but I am not taking anyone in today." However, he leaned in close, his voice lowering so the girls couldn't hear. "Look, sir. You have video this time. But next time she might throw herself down the stairs. Or she might cut herself and put the knife in your hand. This environment is toxic." He adjusted his belt, looking around the room. "You have rights, sure. But you are not safe here. If you have anywhere else to go, a hotel, a friend's house, I strongly suggest you leave tonight. Next time the camera might malfunction." I looked at the officers walking out the door. I looked at Harper and Madison, who were glaring at me with pure hatred, furious that their trap had failed. The officer was right. I had won the battle, but I was in danger of losing the war if I stayed under this roof one more night. They were desperate now, and desperate people were dangerous. "I will pack a bag," I said to the empty room. But I wasn't retreating. I was just moving to a new battlefield. I threw the last of my shirts into the duffel bag, the police officer's warning still ringing in my ears. I was not running away. I was making a tactical retreat. But as I walked out to my truck, a black sedan pulled up to the curb. A man in a cheap suit stepped out holding a thick manila envelope. He did not look like a friend. He looked like a process server. "Are you Augustus Bennett?" he asked, checking a clipboard. "I am," I said, bracing myself. "You have been served," he said, thrusting the envelope into my chest, before retreating to his car, like a cockroach scurrying from the light. I sat on the tailgate of my truck, the streetlights flickering on above me, and tore open the seal. The letterhead was embossed and expensive: Patterson, Sterling, and Holt Attorneys at Law. I knew the firm. They were sharks who charged $500 an hour to destroy families. I began to read, and with every sentence the air in my lungs turned a little colder. It was not just an eviction notice. It was a declaration of total war. Dear Mr. Bennett, it began, we represent the estate of Beatrice Bennett and the majority shareholders of the Bee's Knees. It has come to our attention that you are currently in possession of misappropriated company assets, specifically the Ford truck, various proprietary recipe logs, and access credentials for the corporate banking accounts. Misappropriated. They were calling me a thief for driving the truck I used to deliver flour for 12 years, but the letter did not stop there. It demanded the immediate return of all keys, the surrender of all passwords, and a full accounting of every cent I had spent in the last 6 months. They gave me 48 hours. 2 days to erase myself from the business I built, or they would seek a court order for the seizure of my personal assets. But the paragraph that nearly made me vomit was on the second page. Furthermore, it read, our clients have reason to believe that during the final months of Mrs. Bennett's illness, you exercised undue influence over a vulnerable adult to secure financial favors. We are prepared to file a civil suit for elder financial abuse and fraud if you do not comply with all demands immediately and waive any claim to the estate. I stared at the words until they blurred. Undue influence. They were accusing me of manipulating Beatrice. They were accusing me of taking advantage of the woman I had nursed through 4 rounds of chemo, the woman I had held while she cried in pain, the woman I had loved more than my own life. They were twisting my devotion into a crime. I looked up at the house. Harper and Madison were probably watching from the window, laughing, thinking this letter was the nail in my coffin. They thought threatening my reputation would make me crawl into a hole and die. They thought accusing me of abusing Beatrice would shame me into submission. They were wrong. They had not shamed me. They had just removed the last barrier of my conscience. I crumpled the letter in my fist, the paper cracking like dry bones. They wanted to talk about fraud. They wanted to talk about financial abuse. Fine. I would give them a lesson in forensic accounting they would never forget. I was not going to surrender the passwords. I was going to give them the keys to a kingdom that was already burning down. I drove to a place called the Rusty Nail, a dive bar on the outskirts of the industrial district, where the floor was always sticky and the lighting was dim enough to hide secrets. It was the last place anyone would look for a multi-million-dollar legal strategy which made it perfect. Sullivan was already there nursing a bourbon in a booth in the back. He looked less like a lawyer and more like a retired prizefighter who had gone a few too many rounds. I slid onto the cracked vinyl seat across from him and tossed Patterson's threatening letter onto the table. Sullivan read it, his thick eyebrows knitting together. When he finished, he let out a low, dangerous whistle. They are playing Dirty Gus, he said, tapping the paragraph about elder abuse. This is not just a demand letter. This is a character assassination attempt. They want to scare you into settling before you realize what you actually have. If we go to court with this, it will get ugly. They will drag Beatrice's medical history through the mud. They will paint you as a gold digger who preyed on a dying woman. I am not going to court to defend myself, I said, reaching into my jacket. I am going to court to foreclose on them. I pulled out a thin blue folder and placed it on top of their letter. Sullivan opened it. Inside was a document dated 10 years ago, notarized and signed by both Beatrice and myself. It was labeled Commercial Lease and Intellectual Property License Agreement Addendum B. Sullivan scanned the pages. His eyes stopped moving. He reread the same paragraph twice. Then he looked up at me, his mouth slightly open. Gus, he whispered. Do you know what this says? I wrote it, I replied calmly. Beatrice was terrified of lawsuits. She was afraid that if a customer got sick, or if a delivery driver crashed, they would sue the bakery and take the house. So we separated the assets. Beatrice owned the operating company. But the operating company owns nothing. It rents the building. It licenses the name. It leases the recipes. And the owner of the building, the name, and the recipes is the Augustus Bennett Revocable Trust, Sullivan finished, awe in his voice. You are the sole trustee. Exactly, I said. The operating company, the one Harper and Madison are fighting so hard to inherit, is just a shell. It has the cash flow, sure, but it also has the debts, and its right to exist depends entirely on a lease that can be terminated with 24 hours' notice upon a change of ownership. Sullivan leaned back, a slow grin spreading across his face. You separated the soul from the body. If they take the company without your permission, you can legally strip it naked. They will be left holding a business that cannot use its own name, cannot stay in its own building, but still owes the bank $1.2 million. He leaned forward again, his expression sobering. But Gus, you need to be absolutely clear about this. If we execute this clause, we are not just winning a lawsuit. We are dropping a nuclear bomb. Harper and Madison signed personal guarantees for the business loans when they accepted the executorship. If the business fails, the bank comes for them. They will lose their cars. They will lose their credit scores. They will be bankrupt before they are 35. There is no coming back from this. Are you sure you want to destroy them? I thought about the police officers in my living room. I thought about the letter accusing me of abusing my dying wife. I thought about Harper throwing my clothes into a puddle. They wanted to take everything I said, my voice cold and steady. Let them have it. Pull the trigger. I waited until the digital clock on the microwave blinked past 2 in the morning. The house was silent save for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional settling of the floorboards upstairs. Harper and Madison were asleep, dreaming of their inheritance. I sat at the kitchen island, the glow of my laptop screen illuminating the dark room like a campfire in a cave. This was not a robbery. This was a retrieval operation. I logged into the central server for the bee's knees. I had built this network myself, setting up the inventory management system, the vendor contacts, and the payroll database. My fingers flew across the keyboard. I did not need to hack anything. I was the super admin. I plugged in my 2-terabyte external hard drive, the little light blinking furiously as it began to inhale the soul of the business. I copied everything. The proprietary flour blends, the negotiated pricing contracts with the dairy suppliers that saved us 20% annually, the customer database with 10,000 email addresses, the digital blueprints for the new location we had been planning. I watched the progress bar fill up green and steady. Once the transfer was complete, I opened the system settings. I did not destroy the hardware. That would be illegal. But I had every right to remove my intellectual property from a system I no longer authorized to use it. I selected the folders containing the custom operational software I had coded. I selected the recipe archives. I selected the vendor history. And I hit delete. Are you sure you want to permanently delete these items? The screen asked. I thought about the letter from Patterson accusing me of fraud. I thought about the police officers standing in my living room. I clicked yes. The screen flickered. The folders vanished. I then initiated a remote command to the point-of-sale terminals at the bakery to reset to factory defaults. When they turned them on tomorrow, they would be blank slates. They would have the hardware, sure, but the brain of the company was now in my pocket. I closed the laptop and slipped the hard drive into my jacket. Then I moved to the physical packing. I went out to the garage, moving silently in my socks. I loaded the heavy boxes of files from my safe into the bed of my truck, covering them with a tarp. I took my tools, my drafting table, and the box of vintage vinyl records Madison had tried to sell. I worked with the efficiency of a man who was used to building things up and tearing them down. I was carrying the last box, a crate of architectural reference books, toward the front door when the kitchen light suddenly snapped on. I froze. Harper was standing at the foot of the stairs wearing a silk robe and holding a glass of water. She looked at me, then at the box in my arms, and then at the dark driveway where my truck was parked, fully loaded. A slow, cruel smile spread across her face. She leaned against the banister, swirling the water in her glass. Leaving in the middle of the night, Gus? She asked, her voice thick with sleep and satisfaction. I did not think you would actually have the guts to go. I thought we would have to drag you out by your ankles. I adjusted the grip on the box. I am just getting a head start, Harper. I don't want to be in your way when the appraisers come. She laughed, walking into the kitchen to stand by the island where I had just wiped her company's memory. You know, I almost feel bad for you, almost. But this is just natural selection. You were holding us back. Mom kept you around out of pity, but we don't have that weakness. I looked at her standing there, so confident, so arrogant in a house she did not own, presiding over a business that was now a ghost. You are right, Harper, I said quietly. You definitely don't have any weakness for pity. She waved a hand dismissively. Just make sure you leave the house keys on the counter. And don't think about taking anything valuable. We have an inventory list. I walked out the door into the cold night air. As I was closing it, I heard her voice one last time, drifting into the hallway, talking to herself, or maybe to the ghost of the victory she thought she had won. Finally, she whispered, "The old man knows fear." I shut the door gently. I climbed into my truck, the hard drive warm against my chest. She thought I was fleeing in terror. She had no idea I was just clearing the blast radius. The sun had barely risen when Sullivan made the call that would seal their fate. We were sitting in his office, a pot of strong coffee between us. He put the phone on speaker and winked at me before his voice shifted into a tone of weary resignation. "Patterson," he said, rubbing his eyes for effect, even though the other lawyer couldn't see him. I spoke to Gus. He is done. The police visit, the legal threats, the stress of the eviction. It is too much for a man of his age. He is ready to capitulate. I leaned in, listening to the silence on the other end, followed by a sharp, triumphant exhale. I knew it. Patterson crowed, his voice dripping with arrogance. I told you, Sullivan. These old school types always fold when you apply real pressure. Does he agree to all terms, everything? Sullivan confirmed, sounding defeated. The house, the business interests, the vehicle. He just wants to sign the papers, take his personal effects, and leave Seattle. He is asking for a small stipend for moving expenses, maybe $5,000, just to get settled in Arizona. Patterson laughed, a cruel barking sound. 5,000 fine. We will throw him a bone. It is cheaper than a trial. Draft the final surrender agreement. We will have it ready for signature tomorrow. I sat back in my chair, a cold smile spreading across my face. They had taken the bait. They thought they had broken me. They had no idea I was the one guiding them into the cage. An hour later, my phone buzzed. It was a notification from Instagram. I had created a burner account weeks ago to monitor Madison's feed. She had just gone live. I clicked the screen. Madison and Harper were sitting in a booth at a brunch spot holding mimosas. They were beaming. Guys, huge news. Madison squealed at the camera. We finally got rid of the toxic energy in our lives. The squatter is leaving. The bee's knees is officially ours, 100%. We are going to rebrand, expand, and take over the city. Girl boss, Nash legacy, winning. Harper leaned into the frame, clinking her glass against Madison's. To Mom's empire, she said, and to taking out the trash. I watched them toast to my destruction. I watched them celebrate the theft of 15 years of my labor. I didn't feel angry anymore. I felt the calm focus of a demolition expert watching the timer count down. Sullivan's intercom buzzed. It is Patterson again, his secretary said. He has a change of venue for the signing. Sullivan picked up the line. What is it, Patterson? I thought we were meeting at your office. I could hear Patterson's voice clearly through the speaker. My clients have a special request. They don't want to meet in a stuffy boardroom. They want to celebrate. They are booking the private dining room at the Apex for tomorrow night at 7. They want Gus to come there to sign the papers. The Apex. It was the most expensive restaurant in Seattle, a place where a steak cost more than my first car. It sat on top of the tallest tower looking down on the city. Sullivan looked at me, raising an eyebrow. They want you to come to a five-star restaurant to sign away your life while they eat caviar. It is a power move, Gus. They want to humiliate you publicly. They want to show you that you don't belong in their world. I stood up, buttoning my jacket. They are right, Sullivan. I don't belong in their world, and after tomorrow night neither will they. Tell them I accept. Tell them I will wear my best suit. Sullivan relayed the message. I heard Patterson laugh again before hanging up. Let them have their dinner, I said, walking to the window to look out at the skyline where the apex pierced the clouds. It is the last meal of the condemned. They just don't know the executioner is coming to join them. The elevator doors slid open on the 75th floor, revealing a world of polished marble and floor-to-ceiling glass. The apex smelled of truffle oil, expensive leather, and old money. I stepped out, acutely aware of the image I projected. I was wearing the same suit I had worn to the funeral, but I had intentionally slept in it the night before. It was wrinkled, stained with a drop of coffee on the lapel, and hung loosely on my frame. I hadn't shaved in 2 days. I shuffled my feet as I walked, keeping my head down, embodying the very picture of a broken, defeated old man. The hostess looked me up and down with a sneer usually reserved for stray animals before leading me to the private dining room in the back. Harper and Madison were already there, seated at the head of a long table that could have seated 20. They looked like royalty holding court. Patterson sat to their right, looking like a vulture who had just spotted a carcass. Sullivan sat on the opposite side, looking grim and silent, playing his role to perfection. You are late, Gus, Harper said, not bothering to look up from the wine list. But I suppose time doesn't matter much when you are unemployed and homeless. I pulled out a chair at the far end of the table, sitting as far away from them as possible. I didn't say a word. I just stared at the white linen tablecloth, letting my hands tremble visibly on the surface. Let us get the grand tasting menu, Madison chirped, snapping her gum. And the Wagyu beef. Oh, and another bottle of the Cristal. We are celebrating a huge acquisition. The waiter rushed off to fulfill their orders, probably calculating a tip that would equal my monthly Social Security check. Harper turned her gaze to me, her eyes cold and predatory. She gestured to the view of the glittering city lights below us. We brought you here for a reason, Gus, she said, her voice dripping with condescension. This is the top of the world. This is where the winners sit. We wanted you to see what real success looks like one last time before you go back to, well, wherever people like you go. The gutter. I assume Madison laughed, a cruel tinkling sound. Do you have a box yet, Gus? I hear the refrigerator boxes are the roomiest. You should grab one before the rainy season starts. Patterson chuckled along with them, clearly enjoying the show. He slid a thick document across the polished wood. It stopped right in front of my shaking hands. This is the surrender agreement, Mr. Bennett, Patterson said, his tone oozing arrogance. It transfers all rights, titles, and interests in the estate, the real estate, and the business entity known as the Bee's Knees to my clients. It also includes a non-disclosure agreement and a waiver of all future claims. Sign this and we won't pursue the elder abuse charges. We will let you walk away without a criminal record. I looked at the document. It was the death warrant of my life's work. To them, it was a victory lap. To me, it was the trigger mechanism for a trap they didn't even know they were standing on. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a cheap plastic pen. I hesitated, letting the tip hover over the paper. I looked up at Harper, making sure my eyes were watery and fearful. I don't have the energy to fight you anymore, I said, my voice cracking and wavering just enough to sound pathetic. You win, Harper. You win. I just want my old pickup truck and my monthly pension payments. Please just let me have that. You girls, you take it all. Patterson opened his laptop, the keys clacking loudly in the silent room as he prepared to finalize the digital document for printing. He looked like a man carving a trophy. I sat slumped in my chair, staring at my hands, while Harper swirled her wine glass, watching the screen with the intensity of a hawk circling a dying rabbit. Wait, Harper said sharply, holding up a hand. I want an additional clause. I want it in writing that Augustus Bennett waives any and all future claims to the brand name, the bee's knees, the logo, the recipes, and the real estate. I want language that says he cannot even open a lemonade stand in this county without our permission. I want him erased from the history of this business. Patterson typed furiously, nodding in agreement. Excellent point, Harper. We will add a non-compete and a total intellectual property surrender. We don't want him trying to launch a rival bakery across the street. I kept my head down, hiding the flicker of amusement in my eyes. A rival bakery, I didn't need to start a rival bakery. I owned the building they were sitting in, metaphorically speaking, but I let out a heavy, defeated sigh, shrinking further into my suit. Is that really necessary? I asked, my voice trembling. I just want to retire. I am not going to compete with you. Harper sneered. We are not taking chances, Gus. You are a leech. We are salting the earth so you can never come back. Put it in Patterson. Sullivan cleared his throat. He shifted in his seat, looking uncomfortable and outmatched. He adjusted his glasses and looked at Patterson with a pleading expression that was pure theater. Look, if my client is agreeing to a total surrender of assets, including the intellectual property and the real estate interests, we need a shield on our end. We need to ensure a clean break. What kind of shield? Patterson asked, suspicious but arrogant. Sullivan pulled a piece of paper from his briefcase. It was a standard yet lethal liability clause. If Mr. Bennett is walking away with nothing, he also walks away with no baggage. We require a full assumption of liability clause. It states that upon signature, the new owners, Harper and Madison, assume 100% of the legal and financial responsibility for the corporate entity known as the Bee's Knees Operating LLC. This includes all current accounts, payable all outstanding loans, all tax liabilities, and any future litigation. Patterson waved his hand dismissively. Standard boilerplate. Of course they assume the liabilities. That is how buying a business works. They get the assets, they get the bills. My clients are aware that running a multi-million-dollar empire has expenses. Harper laughed, sipping her champagne. We can handle the bills, Sullivan. The cash flow from 1 month of operations covers whatever peanuts Gus owes the flour vendor. Add the clause. I don't care. I just want his signature on the surrender. Sullivan looked at me, a flash of grim satisfaction in his eyes that only I could see. He turned back to Patterson. Very well. Add the clause. Effective. The moment of signing, Gus Bennett is free and clear, and your clients are solely responsible for every single cent the company owes. Patterson typed it in. Done. The contract is ready. I watched the printer in the corner whir to life. It was spitting out their doom page by page. They were so obsessed with taking the assets, so blinded by the revenue numbers they had seen in the safe, that they didn't pause to ask why a successful business had a separate operating entity. They didn't ask about the debt service. They just saw the crown and didn't notice it was made of lead. Harper smiled at me, a cold, predatory baring of teeth. Get your pen ready, Gus. It is time to sign your life away. I reached into my pocket, my fingers brushing against the cheap plastic pen. I wasn't signing my life away. I was signing their bankruptcy decree, and the best part was they had demanded it. Patterson picked up the fresh stack of warm paper from the printer, tapping the edges on the mahogany table to align them. He pulled a gold fountain pen from his pocket, unscrewing the cap with a slow, deliberate twist. He was enjoying this. He was the architect of my destruction, or so he thought. But as he scanned this final page, his eyes lingered on the liability clause Sullivan had insisted on. He frowned, a flicker of professional caution piercing through his arrogance. He cleared his throat, looking over his reading glasses at Harper. Harper, before we schedule the formal execution of this agreement, I need to make sure you understand the scope of this liability clause. It is comprehensive. You are not just inheriting the assets and the revenue streams. You are personally guaranteeing every outstanding debt the company holds. Have we completed a full audit of the current liabilities? Harper didn't even look up from her phone calculator. She was too busy doing the math on her imaginary fortune. We saw the binders, Patterson, she said dismissively, taking a sip of her champagne. The company pulled in $2 million last year. $2 million. Whatever petty debts Gus racked up buying flour and sugar is irrelevant. We can pay off his credit cards with 1 week of revenue, but Patterson hesitated. Revenue is not profit, Harper. If there are long-term loans or lien encumbrances, Harper slammed her glass down, the crystal ringing dangerously. Stop trying to bill me for more hours, Patterson. We walked through the bakery. We saw the inventory. We saw the customer lines. The business is a cash cow. Gus is a penny pincher. Look at him. Does he look like a man who knows how to leverage debt? He probably pays for everything in cash. We are taking the deal. I sat there staring at the tablecloth, hiding the fact that I was holding my breath. She was so blinded by the top-line number, by the sheer volume of cash that moved through the business, that she forgot to ask about the cost of doing business. She forgot to ask about the mortgage on the equipment. She forgot to ask about the tax structures. She saw a gold coin and didn't realize it was glued to the third rail of a subway track. Madison wasn't even listening to the legal conversation. She had pulled a booklet of paint swatches from her purse and was holding them up against the dim lighting of the restaurant. I am thinking we paint the executive office in midnight charcoal, she announced, interrupting Patterson. It gives off a much more CEO vibe than that depressing beige Gus has in there. And we need to rip out that carpet. I want polished concrete. It is more industrial chic. She looked at me, a cruel smirk playing on her lips. Don't worry, Gus. We will donate the old carpet to whatever shelter you end up in. I didn't respond. I just kept my head down, playing the part of the beaten dog. Harper turned back to Patterson, her patience evaporated. I want this done now. I don't want to give him time to reconsider or hide assets. We sign tomorrow morning. 9 a.m. sharp at your office. Draw up the final clean copies. Patterson shrugged, capping his pen. You are the boss, Harper. If you are comfortable with the risk assessment, we proceed. I am comfortable, she snapped. I want him out. I want his name off the deeds, off the accounts, and off my property by noon tomorrow. She looked at me, her eyes shining with the manic energy of absolute greed. Did you hear that, Gus? Tomorrow morning? 9 a.m. Bring the truck keys and the gate codes. And don't be late. I have a contractor coming at 10 to measure for the remodel. I nodded slowly, rising from the table with the stiffness of an old man who has given up. I will be there, I whispered. I walked out of the restaurant, leaving them to finish their $1,000 dinner. They were arguing about furniture and paint colors. They were planning how to decorate a sinking ship. They were rushing toward the cliff edge at full speed, and they had just ordered me to cut the brakes. Tomorrow couldn't come fast enough. I drove back to the house in silence, the city lights blurring past me like streaks of neon rain. When I pulled into the driveway, every light in the bungalow was blazing. It looked like a lighthouse warning ships away from a rocky shore, but inside the shipwreck was already happening. I walked in through the front door, my key still useless, relying on the fact that they were too excited to lock up. Harper and Madison were in the dining room, surrounded by catalogs and fabric swatches. They didn't even look up as I walked past. They were arguing over whether to install a commercial-grade espresso machine or a wine fridge in the office. They were spending money that didn't exist, planning a future on land that was about to disappear from under their feet. I went to the living room and sat on the beige sofa. I reached into my bag and pulled out the small framed photo of Beatrice I had managed to save before Harper turned the bedroom into her command center. It was a picture of us on a fishing boat, windblown and laughing, holding up a salmon. She looked so happy. She looked so proud of the life we had built. I traced the line of her smile with my thumb. I am sorry, Bea, I whispered into the darkness of the room. I promised I would take care of them. I promised I would keep them safe, but I cannot save them from themselves. They have become monsters, B, and monsters need to be stopped before they devour everything you worked for. This is going to hurt them. It is going to break them. But it is the only lesson they will ever understand. I kissed the glass and tucked the photo into my jacket pocket right next to my heart. I lay down on the stiff cushions, pulling my coat over me as a blanket. I expected to toss and turn, to be haunted by guilt or fear. But as I closed my eyes, a profound sense of calm settled over me. It was the calm of a structural engineer who has identified a critical fault and knows the demolition is necessary to prevent a greater catastrophe. I fell asleep to the sound of their voices in the next room, haggling over the price of Italian marble. I slept dreamlessly. I slept soundly. I slept better than I had since the day Beatrice died. When I woke up, the sun was streaming through the windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. The house was quiet. I sat up and looked toward the dining room. Harper and Madison had fallen asleep at the table, their heads resting on open catalogs. An empty wine bottle stood between them like a trophy. They looked exhausted, their faces slack, their greed temporarily paused by biology. I stood up and straightened my tie. I brushed the lint off my suit. I went to the kitchen and drank a glass of tap water. I didn't make coffee. I didn't want to wake them. I wanted them to wake up on their own, hungover and rushing unprepared for the cliff edge they were running toward. I walked to the front door and opened it, letting the cool morning air fill my lungs. I looked back one last time at the sleeping figures of my stepdaughters. They thought they were waking up to a coronation. They thought they were waking up to millions. I stepped out onto the porch and pulled the door shut with a soft click. Today, I whispered to the closed door. Today, you will finally learn who the real owner is. I arrived at the glass and steel fortress of Patterson Sterling and Holt at 8:55. I wore my funeral suit, the same one I had slept in 2 nights ago, ensuring it looked rumpled and defeated. I wanted to smell like resignation. The receptionist, a woman who likely made more in a year than my pension paid in 5, looked at my scuffed boots with undisguised disdain before buzzing me through the heavy oak double doors. The conference room was a cavern of intimidation, designed to make anyone on the wrong side of the table feel small. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the Seattle skyline, a view that cost $500 an hour. Harper and Madison were already seated at the head of the long, polished mahogany table, looking like queens holding court on execution day. Harper was wearing a sharp white power suit that probably cost more than the remodel of the guest bathroom. She looked crisp, professional, and utterly cold. Madison sat beside her, tapping furiously on her phone, bored by the inconvenience of destroying a man's life before her morning latte. Patterson sat between them, a shark in a 3-piece suit, arranging a stack of documents with the precision of a surgeon preparing to amputate a limb. Sullivan, my lawyer, sat quietly to the side, his face a mask of grim acceptance. I walked to the single chair placed on the opposite side of the vast table. It felt less like a seat and more like a witness stand. I did not sit down immediately. I stood there, letting my shoulders slump, letting my hands tremble slightly as I gripped the back of the chair. "You are early," Gus Harper said, not bothering to look up from the document she was reviewing. "I suppose you are eager to get back to whatever bridge you plan on sleeping under." "I just want this to be over," I said, my voice cracking perfectly. "I just want to leave." Patterson looked up, a smug smile stretching across his face. "Sit down, Mr. Bennett. Let us not drag this out. We have a very tight schedule today. My clients have a contractors meeting at 10 to begin the renovations on the property." I sat down, keeping my eyes on the table. I could feel their eyes on me, dissecting me, enjoying the sight of the stepfather they hated finally being brought to heel. They saw a broken old man. They did not see the architect who knew that the structural integrity of this room was about to fail. Madison finally put her phone down and sighed loudly. "Can we hurry this up? I have a lash appointment at 11. Seriously, Gus, just sign the papers so we never have to look at your sad face again. Patterson cleared his throat and slid a heavy-bound document across the table. It slid effortlessly on the polished wood, stopping inches from my hand. This is the master settlement agreement, he announced. By signing this, you transfer all rights to the real estate, the business assets, the inventory, and the operating accounts of the Bee's Knees to Harper and Madison. You also agree to a permanent restraining order and a non-disparagement clause. I looked at the thick stack of paper. It was my death warrant, or so they thought. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my cheap plastic pen. I hesitated, letting the tip hover over the signature line. Is the truck included? I asked softly. Harper rolled her eyes, an expression of pure exasperation. Yes, Gus. You get your stupid truck. We don't want that rusty eyesore in the driveway anyway. Now stop stalling. She reached out her manicured finger, tapping the paper aggressively. She leaned forward, her eyes locking onto mine with a look of absolute final victory. Sign it, she commanded, her voice cold as the grave. Sign it, and then get out of our lives forever. I looked down at the signature line, the black ink staring back at me like a void. Augustus Bennett. That was the name of the man who had built the deck, the man who had kneaded the dough, the man who had loved their mother. And now that name was the only thing standing between them and the millions they thought they deserved. I let my hand hover over the paper, trembling not from fear, but from the sheer adrenaline of the moment. This was it. The point of no return. Patterson cleared his throat, a dry, impatient sound. Right there, Mr. Bennett. Next to the X, press hard. It is a carbon copy. I pressed the tip of the cheap pen to the paper. I wrote the A, slowly dragging the loop out. I could feel Harper's eyes boring into the top of my head. She was practically vibrating with greed, leaning so far over the table that I could smell her expensive hair product. I signed my first name. I paused. I took a breath that shuddered in my chest, playing the part of the broken old man to the very end. Keep going, Madison hissed. Do not stop now. I finished the signature. Bennett. The ink glistened wet on the page. I lifted the pen. Before I could even cap it, Harper's hand shot out across the table. Her manicured claws snatched the document away from me with a violence that tore the corner of the page. She pulled the stack of papers close to her chest, her eyes scanning the signature line frantically. She was checking to make sure I hadn't tricked her, that I hadn't signed Mickey Mouse or misspelled my own name to void the contract. She traced the letters with her finger, her lips moving silently. It is done, she whispered, her voice trembling with ecstasy. She looked up at Patterson, her eyes wide and shining. It is valid. It is legally binding. Patterson nodded, a smug grin plastering his face as he began to pack up his briefcase. It is ironclad, Harper. As of this moment, you and Madison are the sole owners of the Bee's Knees Operating LLC and the undisputed heirs to the residential estate. Mr. Bennett has formally waived all claims. Congratulations. You are millionaires. Harper threw her head back and let out a laugh that sounded less like joy and more like a hyena finding a carcass. It was a loud, ugly, triumphant sound that echoed off the glass walls of the conference room. Madison joined in, clapping her hands together like a child at a birthday party. We did it, Madison squealed. We actually did it. Harper stopped laughing and looked at me. Her face hardened instantly. The mask of civility, thin as it was, dropped completely. There was no thank you. There was no goodbye. There was only the cold, hard stare of a landlord evicting a pest. She stood up, clutching the contract to her chest like a shield. She looked past me to the glass doors where a uniformed guard was standing. Done, she declared, her voice sharp and dismissive. Security. The guard straightened up. Yes, ma'am, escort this man out of my building, Harper commanded, pointing a finger at me. He is trespassing on private property. And if he tries to come back, call the police." She looked down at me, her lip curling in disgust. "Goodbye, Gus. Enjoy the street." I looked at the guard walking toward me. I looked at Harper and Madison hugging each other, already mentally spending the money they thought they had just secured. They thought the show was over. They thought the curtain had fallen. I did not stand up. I did not move toward the door. Instead, I calmly buttoned my suit jacket and leaned back in the chair, crossing my legs. "Not just yet," I said, my voice dropping the waver. It was no longer the voice of a broken old man. It was the voice of the man who owned the building. Harper froze. "What did you say?" I said. "Not just yet," I repeated, meeting her gaze with a cold, steady stare. "You have your contract, Harper, but you forgot to read the appendix." "Sullivan," I nodded to my lawyer. Sullivan stopped packing his bag. He opened a separate, thin file he had kept on his lap the entire time. He pulled out a single sheet of paper. Harper frowned, her grip on the contract tightening. "What is this? The deal is done. Get out." "Read it, Sullivan," I ordered. Sullivan cleared his throat, his voice booming in the suddenly silent room. "Before Mr. Bennett departs, there is one final document that requires disclosure regarding the asset transfer. Exhibit B." The security guard took a step toward me, reaching out to grab my elbow. He expected a frail, resistance-free removal. He expected to guide a confused senior citizen to the elevator. Instead, I shifted in my chair, planting my feet firmly on the expensive carpet. I looked up at him, and for the first time in 3 days, I let the mask slip completely. "Do not touch me, son," I said. My voice was no longer the raspy, trembling whisper of a defeated pensioner. It was the deep, resonating baritone of a man who had commanded construction crews for 40 years. It was a voice that had brokered steel contracts and shouted over jackhammers. The guard froze, his hand hovering in midair. He looked at me, then at Harper, unsure of who was actually in charge. Harper stomped her foot, her face flushing with irritation. "What is this? Why are you still sitting there?" "Officer, remove him immediately. He is trespassing on my property." I stood up slowly. I did not hunch. I did not shuffle. I rose to my full height of 6'2". I reached up and adjusted my tie, tightening the knot with deliberate precision. I smoothed the lapels of my rumpled jacket, brushing off the imaginary dust of their disrespect. The watery, fearful look in my eyes vanished instantly, replaced by a gaze as cold and hard as the concrete foundation of this building. I looked directly at Harper, piercing through her layer of arrogance with a clarity that made her step back. "Sit down, Harper," I said. It was not a request. It was an order. She blinked, stunned by the sudden change in atmospheric pressure. "Excuse me. You do not give orders here. You are a nobody. You just signed away your rights. You have nothing." "I signed away my rights to the operating company." I corrected her, my voice filling the room with a terrifying calm. "I signed away the liabilities. I signed away the headaches. But you were so in a rush to claim your prize, so desperate to steal the crown, that you did not bother to check if the castle actually came with the throne." I turned my head slightly to the side and gave a sharp nod to Sullivan. My lawyer was already moving. He had stopped packing his bag. The look of grim defeat was gone from his face, replaced by the sharp, predatory focus of a litigator going in for the kill. He opened a separate compartment in his briefcase, one that Patterson had not noticed earlier. He pulled out a single, crisp document in a blue folder. Patterson frowned, his legal instincts finally kicking in as he sensed the trap springing shut. "What is that?" "We have the master agreement. The deal is closed. Everything else is irrelevant." "The deal regarding the company shares is closed," Sullivan said, his voice smooth and dangerous. He slid the blue folder across the long mahogany table. It spun perfectly, coming to a stop right in front of Harper's manicured hands. But Mr. Bennett's signature on the transfer triggered a pre-existing condition in the original corporate charter. You really should have done better due diligence, Patterson. Harper looked down at the folder as if it were a bomb. Her hand trembled slightly. What is this? I am not reading any more of your garbage. I am calling the police. I leaned forward, placing my hands flat on the table, leaning into her space just enough to make her flinch. You are going to want to read this one, Harper, I said, a dark smile touching the corners of my lips. Because it concerns the roof over your head. We are not leaving yet. We still have one more document to review. It is called Appendix B. Sullivan opened the blue folder with the slow, deliberate movements of a priest opening a holy book at a funeral. The room was so quiet, you could hear the hum of the air conditioning unit 50 floors below. He adjusted his glasses, smoothed the single sheet of paper flat on the table, and looked up at Harper and Madison. They were still looking at him with disdain, waiting for some minor technicality they could brush aside with their checkbook. They had no idea that Sullivan was about to read the obituary of their entire future. Clause 4, subsection. Sullivan began, his voice projecting clearly to the back of the room. Regarding the commercial lease and intellectual property rights. The entity known as the Bee's Knees Operating LLC is hereby granted a revocable, non-transferable, royalty-free license to utilize the brand name, the logo, the proprietary recipes, and the physical premises located at 440 Main Street and 1200 Pine Avenue. He paused, looking over the rim of his glasses to make sure they were listening. Harper rolled her eyes, checking her watch. We know this, Sullivan. Mom owned the company, so the company uses the name. Get to the point. Sullivan continued, his voice dropping an octave, becoming harder. This license is granted solely and exclusively to Beatrice Bennett for the duration of her natural life. It is expressly not attached to the shares of the company. Upon the death of Beatrice Bennett, or upon any transfer of majority ownership in the operating LLC to any other party, this license is immediately and automatically revoked. The silence that followed was heavy, confused. Madison frowned, looking up from her phone. What does revoked mean, like we have to renew the permit? Sullivan looked at her with something almost like pity. No, Madison. It means that the trademark, the Bee's Knees, the yellow and black logo, the secret croissant recipe, and the buildings themselves do not belong to the company. They never did. They belong to the Augustus Bennett Revocable Trust. The company was just a tenant. And as of the moment you signed that transfer agreement 5 minutes ago, the lease is over. Harper slammed her hand on the table. That is a lie. Mom built that brand. It is her name on the door, Sullivan pointed to the bottom of the document. And here is Beatrice Bennett's signature, dated 10 years ago, acknowledging that Augustus Bennett is the sole owner of all intellectual property and real estate assets, having purchased them with separate funds prior to the expansion. She signed this to protect the assets from liability. She knew that if the business failed, she wanted the buildings to be safe. And who did she entrust them to? Her husband. I watched Patterson. The arrogance that had coated him like oil was evaporating by the second. His skin, usually a flushed pink from expensive scotch and high blood pressure, turned the color of old ash. He stared at the blue folder as if it were radioactive. He knew what those words meant. He knew he had just let his clients sign a document assuming millions of dollars in debt for a company that had just lost its right to exist. Let me see, that Patterson croaked, his voice a dry rasp. He didn't wait for permission. He lunged across the table, his composure shattering. He snatched the document from under Sullivan's hand, nearly knocking over a water glass. He pulled it close to his face, his eyes darting frantically across the lines, desperate to find a loophole, a missing date, a forgery. He scanned the first paragraph. He scanned the second. I saw his Adam's apple bob as he swallowed hard. His hands began to shake, rattling the paper. He looked for the termination clause. He found it. Immediately and automatically revoked. There was no grace period. There was no negotiation. Oh my God, Patterson whispered. The paper slipped from his fingers and drifted back onto the mahogany table. He looked up at me, and for the first time I saw genuine fear in the eyes of a shark who just realized he was swimming in a tank with no water. He looked at Harper, who was waiting for him to tell her it was a joke. "Tell them it is fake, Patterson." Harper demanded, her voice rising in panic. "Tell him he is lying." Patterson shook his head slowly, looking like he was about to be sick. "It is valid, Harper. It is signed. It is notarized. You don't own the brand. You don't own the building. You just bought a bakery that isn't allowed to bake. Let me explain it to you in simple terms. Harper, since you seem to be struggling with the concept of corporate structure." I stood up and walked slowly around the mahogany table, my footsteps the only sound in the room. You see, businesses are not just cash registers and Instagram accounts. They are legal entities. And what you and Madison just fought so hard to inherit, what you just signed your names to, is the operating company. I stopped behind Patterson, who was still staring at the document in horror. "The operating company is the engine," I continued. "It hires the staff. It buys the flour. It pays the insurance. It takes on the loans. But an engine is useless without a chassis, and it is useless without fuel. The fuel is the recipes. The chassis is the real estate. And as Mr. Sullivan just pointed out, I own the fuel and I own the chassis." I gestured to the window toward the city below. Those 5 bakery locations, the prime real estate in Capitol Hill and Queen Anne. I bought those buildings 15 years ago with my own money. The company pays rent to me. The brand name, The Bee's Knees. I trademarked it in 2005. The company pays a licensing fee to use it. And do you know what the fee is? $1 a year. It was a gift to your mother. But gifts can be taken back. Madison looked up, her face pale. But the house. We have the deed to the house. Mom left it to us." I shook my head, a dark chuckle escaping my throat. "You really did not read the trust, did you? The house at 440 Main Street is classified as a mixed-use commercial asset. It is the registered headquarters of the trust. When Beatrice transferred the business assets to the operating company, she kept the real estate separate to protect it from lawsuits. The house is not part of her personal estate. It belongs to the landlord. And I am the landlord." Harper stood up, knocking her chair back. "That is impossible. You are lying. We live there." "You live there because I allowed it," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerously low register. "You live there because I loved your mother, and she asked me to be kind to you. But kindness has an expiration date. Harper and yours ran out the moment you threw my clothes into the mud. You are not heiresses. You are squatters in my house, and you are unauthorized operators in my buildings." I walked back to my seat and picked up the signed contract. I held it up. "You wanted to be the owners. Well, congratulations. You now own a company that has no name, no product, and nowhere to do business. You own a shell, and that shell is very, very expensive to maintain." I turned to Sullivan. "What is the time?" 10:12 a.m., Sullivan replied, checking his watch. "Let the record show," I announced, looking directly into the security camera in the corner of the room, "that as of 10:12 a.m. I am officially exercising my option to terminate all lease agreements. I am revoking the trademark license effective immediately. You are hereby ordered to cease and desist all operations using the name The Bee's Knees. You are ordered to vacate all commercial premises, and you are ordered to remove all personal belongings from the residential property at 440 Main Street." I looked at Harper, whose mouth was opening and closing like a fish out of water. "You wanted me out of your life, Harper. I am granting your wish. I am taking everything that is mine, and I am leaving. Good luck running a bakery with no ovens, no roof, and no name." Sullivan waited for the echo of my eviction order to fade before he cleared his throat again. He did not look triumphant. He looked like a coroner explaining a particularly gruesome cause of death. He flipped a page in the blue folder, revealing a spreadsheet dense with red ink. Harper and Madison were staring at me with hollow eyes, their brains struggling to process the fact that they were homeless. But they did not yet realize they were also destitute. "There is one more matter," Sullivan said, his tone clinically detached. "We need to address the solvency of the operating company. You see, while the business generated significant revenue, it also carried significant weight. Specifically, a commercial expansion loan from First National Bank with a remaining principal of $1.2 million. And due to some aggressive accounting errors made by your mother in her final years, there is an outstanding liability for deferred payroll taxes totaling $500,000. Madison made a small choking sound. $1.7 million, she whispered. But we saw the bank accounts. There was cash. That was operating cash, Sullivan explained. It cycles in and out, but the debt, that is permanent. For the last 5 years, Mr. Bennett has been paying the monthly debt service of $12,000 out of his personal pension and investment dividends. He did it to keep the business afloat and to keep your mother from worrying. He was effectively subsidizing the company's existence." I leaned back in my chair, watching the blood drain from Harper's face. She was doing the math. She was realizing that without my monthly contribution, the business was not a cash cow. It was a bleeding wound. "But that stops today," I said softly. "I am no longer subsidizing your lifestyle. And since I just revoked the lease and the trademark, your revenue stream just dropped to zero. But the bank does not care about that. The bank just wants its money." Patterson dropped his head into his hands. He knew what was coming. He knew the clause he had let slip through. Sullivan pointed to the paragraph in the contract they had just signed. The ink was barely dry. Under the full assumption of liability clause, he read the new owners hereby accept full personal responsibility for all corporate debts, liens, and encumbrances. This means the corporate veil has been pierced by your own hand. You did not just sign for the company. You signed a personal guarantee. Harper stood up, shaking so hard she had to grip the table to stay upright. "What does that mean?" she shrieked. "It means," Patterson muttered into his hands, his voice muffled and defeated. "It means if the company cannot pay, the bank comes for you. They will take your personal savings. They will lien your cars. They will garnish your wages. They will come for everything you own until the $1.7 million is paid." The room spun. I could see it in their eyes. They were looking at a future of bankruptcy courts and seized assets. Madison began to hyperventilate, clutching her chest. Harper looked at the papers scattered on the table, the papers she had been so desperate to sign. "This is a setup," she screamed, her voice cracking into a hysterical sob. "You tricked us. You knew the company was in debt, and you let us sign it. This is fraud. You are a con artist." "Gus," I stood up slowly, buttoning my jacket. I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw nothing but a spoiled child who had finally touched the hot stove she was warned about. "No, Harper," I said, my voice calm, steady, and final. "This is not fraud. This is business. You were so busy counting the money you thought you deserved that you forgot the first rule of any contract. You did not read the fine print." I signaled to the guard, who was now looking at me with newfound respect. "I think we are done here." Sullivan waited for the echo of my eviction order to fade before he cleared his throat again. He did not look triumphant. He looked like a coroner explaining a particularly gruesome cause of death. He flipped a page in the blue folder, revealing a spreadsheet dense with red ink. Harper and Madison were staring at me with hollow eyes, their brains struggling to process the fact that they were homeless. But they did not yet realize they were also destitute. "There is one more matter," Sullivan said, his tone clinically detached. "We need to address the solvency of the operating company. You see, while the business generated significant revenue, it also carried significant weight." Specifically, a commercial expansion loan from First National Bank with a remaining principal of $1.2 million. And due to some aggressive accounting errors made by your mother in her final years, there is an outstanding liability for deferred payroll taxes totaling $500,000. Madison made a small, choking sound. 1.7 million, she whispered. But we saw the bank accounts. There was cash. That was operating cash, Sullivan explained. It cycles in and out, but the debt that is permanent. For the last 5 years, Mr. Bennett has been paying the monthly debt service of $12,000 out of his personal pension and investment dividends. He did it to keep the business afloat and to keep your mother from worrying. He was effectively subsidizing the company's existence. I leaned back in my chair, watching the blood drain from Harper's face. She was doing the math. She was realizing that without my monthly contribution, the business was not a cash cow. It was a bleeding wound. But that stops today, I said softly. I am no longer subsidizing your lifestyle. And since I just revoked the lease and the trademark, your revenue stream just dropped to zero. But the bank does not care about that. The bank just wants its money. Patterson dropped his head into his hands. He knew what was coming. He knew the clause he had let slip through. Sullivan pointed to the paragraph in the contract they had just signed. The ink was barely dry. Under the full assumption of liability clause, he read the new owners hereby accept full personal responsibility for all corporate debts, liens, and encumbrances. This means the corporate veil has been pierced by your own hand. You did not just sign for the company, you signed a personal guarantee. Harper stood up, shaking so hard she had to grip the table to stay upright. What does that mean? She shrieked. It means, Patterson muttered into his hands, his voice muffled and defeated. It means if the company cannot pay, the bank comes for you. They will take your personal savings. They will lien your cars. They will garnish your wages. They will come for everything you own until the 1.7 million is paid. The room spun. I could see it in their eyes. They were looking at a future of bankruptcy courts and seized assets. Madison began to hyperventilate, clutching her chest. Harper looked at the papers scattered on the table. The papers she had been so desperate to sign. "This is a setup," she screamed, her voice cracking into a hysterical sob. "You tricked us. You knew the company was in debt, and you let us sign it. This is fraud. You are a con artist, Gus." I stood up slowly, buttoning my jacket. I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw nothing but a spoiled child who had finally touched the hot stove she was warned about. "No, Harper, you," I said, my voice calm, steady, and final. "This is not fraud. This is business. You were so busy counting the money you thought you deserved that you forgot the first rule of any contract. You did not read the fine print." I signaled to the guard, who was now looking at me with newfound respect. "I think we are done here." The silence in the conference room shattered instantly. Madison let out a sound that was half gasp, half scream, her hands clawing at her throat, as if the debt were a physical weight crushing her windpipe. She looked at her phone, at the social media feed she had curated so carefully, and then her eyes rolled back. She didn't faint gracefully like they do in the movies. She slumped sideways, sliding off the leather chair and hitting the floor with a heavy, awkward thud. Her legs kicked out involuntarily, knocking over a pitcher of ice water that soaked into the expensive Persian rug. Madison Harper shrieked, but she didn't kneel down to help her sister. She didn't even look at her. She turned on Patterson, grabbing the lapels of his $3,000 suit and shaking him violently. "Fix this. Do something. You are a partner at this firm. You said this was a standard transfer. Find a loophole, find a way out, or I will sue you for malpractice until you are living in a cardboard box." Patterson shoved her away, sweat pouring down his face, ruining his spray tan. He scrambled for the papers, his hands shaking so badly he tore another page. He was muttering to himself, flipping through the statutes, looking for a lifeline. "There has to be a grace period," he stammered. There has to be a squatter's right provision. Constructive trust, yes, we can argue constructive trust. We can argue that by allowing them to use the property for years, an implied easement was created. I watched them unravel. It was pathetic. It was chaos. And I stood in the center of it, an island of absolute calm. "Give it up, Patterson," I said, my voice cutting through their panic. "You are grasping at straws." Patterson looked up, his eyes wild. "I can keep this in court for years, Bennett. I will file injunctions. I will tie up the title." "No, you won't," I replied, shaking my head. "You seem to forget what I did for a living before I retired. I wasn't just a baker. I was an architect. I spent 40 years navigating zoning laws, property easements, and municipal codes. I know more about land use law than you do. I wrote that lease agreement myself, Patterson. I cross-referenced it with the city's commercial overlay statutes. It is bulletproof. There is no implied easement because the lease explicitly defined the terms of use as temporary and revocable." I tapped the blue folder on the table. "You are not fighting a business dispute. You are fighting a landlord-tenant eviction on a commercial property with no lease. In Washington state, that is a summary proceeding. I can have the sheriff there in 48 hours to padlock the doors." Patterson slumped back in his chair, the fight draining out of him. He knew I was right. He knew he had been outmaneuvered by a man he had dismissed as a senile old fool. He looked at Harper, who was now sobbing, pulling at her hair. I can't fix this, Harper," he whispered. "You signed the liability waiver. It is over." Harper looked at me, her face a mask of ruined mascara and terror. "Gus, please," she whimpered, her voice tiny and broken. We can work something out. We can be partners. Mom wouldn't want this." I didn't feel pity. I felt the cold, hard satisfaction of justice. I stood up and buttoned my suit jacket, feeling lighter than I had in years. "You are right, Harper. Your mother wouldn't want this. She wouldn't want her husband sleeping on a sofa. She wouldn't want her legacy stolen. But we are past the point of negotiation." I walked to the door, stopping just before I exited. I turned back to look at the wreckage of their arrogance. "You have 24 hours, I said, my voice echoing in the silent room. "I want every personal item removed from 440 Main Street. I want the keys on the counter, and I want the signage taken down from every bakery location. If I see a single Bee's Knees logo up by tomorrow noon, I will charge you $10,000 a day in licensing fees." I opened the door. "Tick-tock, Harper. You are on my time now." I walked down the long, plush corridor of the law firm, my footsteps silent on the carpet, but echoing loudly in my own mind. Sullivan walked beside me, his briefcase swinging rhythmically. He did not say a word until the heavy elevator doors slid shut, sealing us inside the steel box. As the numbers on the display began to count down from 75, he loosened his tie and let out a long, ragged breath. "That was the coldest thing I have ever seen, Gus," he said, looking at me with a mixture of fear and admiration. "You did not just beat them, you dismantled them. You took the floorboards out from under them while they were standing on them." I watched the floor numbers blur. "I did what had to be done, Sullivan. They were a cancer. If you do not cut out the rot completely, it just grows back. Today, we sterilized the wound. The doors opened at the lobby level. I stepped out not into the gloom of a typical Seattle morning, but into a blinding, brilliant column of sunlight. It was rare for the clouds to break like this in October. The light bounced off the glass towers, dazzling my eyes, warming the skin of my face. It felt like a benediction. It felt like the universe was acknowledging that the balance had finally been restored. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the exhaust-tinged city air, and it tasted sweeter than the finest wine. I did not go to my truck immediately. I stood on the corner of 4th and Madison, watching the crowds of people rushing to their jobs, oblivious to the drama that had just unfolded in the sky above them. I pulled my phone from my pocket. It was time to execute the final phase of the operation. I dialed a number I had saved under the name Mike, Signs. He answered on the first ring. Gus Mike bellowed over the sound of a grinder in the background. Good to hear from you. Are we still in a holding pattern? Green light, Mike, I said, my voice steady and clear. It is a go. I want the crews dispatched immediately. Start with the Capitol Hill location. I want the main signage down by noon. Then hit the Queen Anne store. Strip it all. The awnings, the window decals, everything. If it says the bee's knees, I want it in a dumpster. There was a pause, then Mike laughed. You got it, boss. We are rolling out. Do we save the letters? No, I said. Scrap metal, melt it down. We are starting fresh. I hung up. It was done. Within hours, the brand Harper and Madison thought they owned would physically vanish from the city streets. Suddenly, my phone began to vibrate violently in my hand. It was a call from Harper. I let it ring, watching the name flash on the screen. It stopped and immediately started again. This time it was a text from Madison. Gus, please answer. We can talk about this. Mom would not want this. I stared at the message. For years that guilt trip had worked. For years I had bent over backwards to keep the peace because of what Beatrice might want. But Beatrice was gone. And I was the one still here. I did not feel a pang of regret. I did not feel the urge to negotiate. I felt nothing but a profound sense of closure. I tapped the screen. I opened Harper's contact. I scrolled down to the bottom. Block caller. Confirm. I opened Madison's contact. Block caller. Confirm. The phone went silent. The vibrations stopped. The invisible tether that had bound me to their toxicity for 15 years was severed. I put the phone back in my pocket and looked up at the sun. I adjusted my sunglasses, smiled at a passing stranger, and walked toward my truck. I had a lot of packing to do, and for the first time in a long time, I was looking forward to going home. The wheels of justice usually turn slowly, but the wheels of banking algorithms spin at the speed of light. At exactly 8 o'clock in the morning, 1 minute after the banks opened for business, the trap I had set with Sullivan snapped shut. I was sitting in my truck across the street from the flagship bakery, drinking a hot coffee that I had paid for with my very active, very solvent debit card. I watched as Madison walked up to the coffee cart parked on the corner. She ordered her usual oat milk latte, tap-to-pay phone in hand. She held it to the reader. It beeped. A harsh, rejecting sound. She frowned, tapping it again. Another beep. She pulled out a platinum credit card, the one she loved to flash. Declined. I watched her face go from annoyance to panic. She opened her banking app, and even from 50 feet away, I could see her recoil as if the screen had bitten her. The screen didn't show her balance. It showed a red notification box. Account frozen. Lien holder First National Bank. Reason loan default guarantee. Every penny she had, every cent of her influencer earnings was now locked down to cover the $1.7 million debt she had accepted yesterday. She was not just broke. She was negative millions. But the financial ruin was invisible. The physical ruin was happening right in front of her eyes. A heavy diesel engine roared to life behind her. Madison turned around to see a massive yellow crane extending its hydraulic arm toward the roof of the building. My crew had arrived. Mike, my sign guy, didn't waste time. He had his orders. 2 men in harnesses were already up on the ladder attacking the bolts of the main sign. The giant stylized script reading "The bee's knees," the brand Harper claimed was her empire, began to shake. Sparks flew as an angle grinder bit into the metal supports. Passers-by stopped to watch. They weren't mourning. They were taking pictures. I saw a taxi pull up to the curb. Harper stumbled out. She looked like she hadn't slept in 24 hours. She was wearing the same clothes from the lawyer's office, now wrinkled and disheveled. She didn't have her car. I assumed the repo men had already visited the driveway at 440 Main Street. She ran toward the building, screaming at the workers. "Stop it!" she yelled, her voice lost over the sound of the grinder. "You can't do this. That is my name. That is my store." Mike looked down from the ladder, pushed up his welding mask, and shouted back, "Not anymore, lady. Landlord's orders. Lease is terminated." With a final groaning screech of metal, the sign gave way. It swung loose, dangling by a single chain, before dropping onto the flatbed truck below with a deafening crash. The glass neon tubes shattered, sending a cloud of dust into the air. The symbol of their arrogance was now just a pile of sharp, broken trash. But I wasn't done. Mike signaled the crew on the ground. They grabbed ropes and hoisted a new banner temporarily covering the scarred brick where the old sign had been. It unrolled with a snap in the wind. It was simple black canvas with white block letters. Gus's Bakery. Under original management. The crowd on the sidewalk actually cheered. They knew who baked the bread. They knew who made the morning buns. They didn't care about the branding. They cared about the soul of the place. Harper stopped screaming. She stood there on the wet pavement, the Seattle drizzle beginning to soak into her expensive suit. She looked at the shattered sign in the truck. She looked at the new banner flapping in the wind. And then slowly she turned and looked across the street. She saw my truck. She saw me sitting there sipping my coffee, watching the renovation of my life. The look on her face wasn't anger anymore. It wasn't the smug superiority she had worn at the funeral. It was pure, unadulterated devastation. Her shoulders slumped. Her face crumpled. She didn't storm over to confront me. She didn't pull out her phone to call a lawyer. She just stood there in the rain, covering her mouth with her hand, and began to sob. She was a queen without a castle, a CEO without a company, and a daughter who finally realized she had orphaned herself by greed. I was staying in a small corporate rental on 3rd Avenue, a temporary solution, while the crews finished scrubbing the stench of betrayal out of my house. It was late past 11, and the rain was hammering against the window pane with the insistence of a drum. I was reading a book, enjoying the silence, when a knock came at the door. It was not the pounding of police officers or the confident rap of a delivery driver. It was a weak, hesitant scratching, like a stray animal seeking shelter. I knew who it was before I even stood up. I walked to the door and looked through the peephole. The fisheye lens distorted their faces, but even without the distortion, Harper and Madison looked like ghosts. I undid the deadbolt, but left the security chain engaged, cracking the door open just 4 inches. The slice of hallway light revealed a pathetic sight. They were soaked to the bone. Harper's hair, usually blown out to perfection, was plastered to her skull. Madison was shivering violently, hugging herself, her mascara running in dark rivulets down her cheeks. They did not have their designer handbags. They did not have their arrogance. They looked like 2 children who had lost their mother in a supermarket, except these children were 30 years old and had tried to bankrupt their father. Gus Harper choked out, her teeth chattering. "Please, let us in. It is freezing." The bank took the cards. They locked us out of the condo. We have nowhere to go. I looked at them through the crack. I did not move to slide the chain off. "You have friends, Harper," I said calmly. "Go stay with them." We tried. Madison sobbed, stepping forward and gripping the doorframe with white-knuckled hands. "They won't answer. Everyone blocked us. The news is out. Everyone knows about the debt. Gus, please, you can't leave us on the street. We are family." "Family," I repeated, testing the word on my tongue. It tasted like ash. "You ceased to be family the moment you threw my clothes into a puddle. You ceased to be family when you tried to sell my father's watch." Suddenly, the unity they had maintained against me shattered. Harper turned on her sister, shoving her shoulder. "It is her fault," she screamed, pointing a trembling finger at Madison. "She is the one who wanted the remodel. She is the one who spent $50,000 on credit before we even signed the papers. I told her to wait, Madison shrieked back, her voice high and desperate. You liar. You were the one who fired Sarah. You were the one who said Gus was a pushover. It was your plan, Harper. You said we would be rich. They began to argue right there in the hallway, their voices echoing off the walls, blaming each other for the ruin they had built together. It was a cacophony of regret, but not the right kind. They weren't sorry for what they did to me. They were sorry they got caught. They were sorry the math didn't work. Stop, I said. They froze, looking back at me, desperate hope in their eyes. They dropped to their knees on the dirty hallway carpet. Harper clasped her hands together in a prayer position. Gus. We will do anything, she begged, tears mixing with the rain on her face. We will sign whatever you want. We will work in the bakery for minimum wage. Just help us. Please. Fix it. You always fix it. I looked down at them. I remembered the sticky note on the fridge demanding rent. I remembered the laughter in the restaurant while I sat in my rumpled suit. I felt a ghost of the love I once had for them, but it was distant, like a memory of a movie I saw years ago. I cannot fix this, I said, my voice soft but unyielding. You broke it too badly. You wanted to be adults. You wanted to be owners. Well, this is ownership. I started to close the door. Harper lunged forward, jamming her hand into the gap, wailing, No, Gus, no! I looked her in the eye one last time. The greed you nurtured has a price, Harper, I said. And the bill has finally come due. Use the rest of your life to pay for it. I pulled the door firmly. Harper snatched her hand back just in time. The latch clicked shut. I threw the deadbolt. I heard them screaming my name on the other side, pounding on the wood, crying into the void. I turned off the hallway light and walked back to my chair. I picked up my book. I did not turn the page, but I breathed. For the first time in months, the air in the room felt entirely my own. The downfall of Harper and Madison was not a slow decline. It was a free fall. The bank moved with a speed and ruthlessness that made my eviction notice look like a polite suggestion. Within 48 hours of the revelation at the law firm, the foreclosure proceedings on Harper's personal assets began. I heard about the auction from Sullivan. It was held at her luxury condo downtown, the one with the view she loved to brag about. Strangers walked through her living room with their muddy shoes touching her imported Italian sofa, appraising her art collection, and bidding pennies on the dollar for the trophies of her vanity. Harper stood in the corner of the lobby, watching as the repo men loaded her beloved black Porsche onto a flatbed truck. She screamed at them, threatening lawsuits she could not afford, waving a phone that had already been disconnected from service. But the bank did not care. The bankruptcy court judge did not care. I read the transcript of her hearing. When Harper tried to argue that she needed the car for her image as a realtor, the judge simply looked over his glasses and told her that a bus pass would get her to job interviews just as effectively. She was stripped of her license, her credit score was incinerated, and her name was added to a blacklist that meant she would struggle to rent a closet in this city for the next 7 years. Madison's destruction was louder, messier, and far more public. She lived by the internet, and she died by it. The news of the debt and the fraud allegations leaked to the blogs. The hashtag bakery scam started trending locally. Her comments section, once filled with adoring fans and heart emojis, turned into a cesspool of vitriol. People she had blocked, vendors she had stiffed, and former friends she had bullied all came out of the woodwork to expose her. I saw a screenshot of her Instagram feed before she finally deleted her account. It was a massacre. Every sponsor dropped her. The skincare brand, the fashion label, the energy drink company, they all issued public statements distancing themselves from her toxic brand. She lost her income stream overnight. But the debts remained. To survive, the girl who once claimed she was allergic to polyester had to take the only job that would hire someone with a pending fraud investigation. I passed by a diner on the outskirts of town a few weeks later. I did not go inside, but I looked through the plate glass window. There she was. Madison was wearing a faded mustard yellow uniform that hung loosely on her frame. Her hair was pulled back in a hairnet, not a blowout in sight. She was scrubbing a table trying to remove a sticky syrup stain, while a customer pointed a finger in her face complaining about his cold eggs. She looked exhausted. She looked gray. She looked exactly like the service workers she used to mock on her live stream for not hustling hard enough. Harper and Madison had spent their entire adult lives looking down on people who lived paycheck to paycheck. They had sneered at the poor, called them lazy, and treated poverty like a character flaw. Now they were standing in the soup line of life. They were counting coins for laundry. They were terrified of the first of the month. They had become the very thing they despised, not because of bad luck, but because of their own arrogance. They were finally learning the lesson I had tried to teach them for years, that money is not a right, it is a result. And without me to carry them, the result was zero. The morning we finally flipped the sign on the door was not marked by ribbons or confetti or loud music. It was marked by the smell. The rich, earthy scent of sourdough starter and the sweet, warm embrace of cinnamon drifted down Main Street, acting as a silent siren song to a neighborhood that had been starved of quality for too long. I stood behind the counter of Gus's bakery, dusting flour from my apron, and watched as the first customers walked in. They were not looking for Instagram backdrops or gluten-free cardboard. They were looking for the bread Beatrice and I used to make. The line stretched around the block within an hour. I recognized faces I hadn't seen in months. Old regulars who had abandoned the shop during the dark era of Harper and Madison. They shook my hand, some with tears in their eyes, thanking me for bringing the soul back to the building. One bite of a warm croissant, shattered and flaky, was all the marketing we needed. The cash register sang a steady rhythm, but this time the melody was sweet, because the money was clean. It wasn't fueling vanity, it was fueling a legacy. I hired a whole new crew. I didn't look for pedigrees or appearances. I looked for people who knew how to work and who needed a break. I hired a young man named Leo, a former felon who had trouble finding work, but had hands that could shape dough with the tenderness of a surgeon. I hired a single mother for the morning shift and paid her double the minimum wage because I knew what groceries cost. When Leo dropped a tray of muffins on his second day, he flinched, waiting for the screaming to start, waiting for the abuse he was used to. I just handed him a broom and told him that gravity was the only boss we couldn't negotiate with. The look of relief on his face was worth more than any profit margin. I was wealthy now, far wealthier than I had ever been. The business was debt-free and the revenue was entirely mine. But I didn't buy a sports car. I didn't move into a penthouse. I drove my same old truck, though I did treat it to a new transmission. I lived in my house enjoying the luxury of silence. I bought myself a high-end record player and a comfortable leather armchair. That was enough. My wealth was the freedom to wake up without a knot in my stomach. One Tuesday afternoon, during a rare lull, a woman walked in. She was about my age, with silver hair tied back in a loose bun and eyes that crinkled at the corners when she smiled. She wasn't wearing designer labels. She wore a sensible wool coat and a scarf that looked hand-knit. She ordered a coffee and a plain scone, then sat by the window to read a paperback book. I brought a fresh pot of coffee over to refill her cup. She looked up and smiled, closing her book. "This scone is dangerous," she said, her voice warm and melodic. "It reminds me of the baking my grandmother used to do. You can taste the patience in it." "I am Gus," I said, extending my hand. "I am the one with the patience." She took my hand. Her grip was firm, her skin rough like someone who worked in a garden. "I am Elena," she replied. We talked for an hour. We didn't talk about stocks or real estate or who was wearing what. We talked about soil acidity for hydrangeas. We talked about jazz records. We talked about the best way to catch trout in the autumn. She didn't look at me like an ATM. She didn't look at me like a servant. She looked at me like a man. As she gathered her things to leave, she promised to come back for the sourdough. And for the first time in 15 years, I felt a flutter in my chest that had nothing to do with anxiety and everything to do with hope. The storm was over. The sun was finally out. The restoration of the bakery was a point of pride, but I quickly realized it was not my endgame. I had proven what I needed to prove. I had shown the world, and specifically my ungrateful stepdaughters, that the magic was in the creator, not the brand name. But at 70 years old, waking up at 3 a.m. to knead dough was a young man's game. I had built the house, I had defended the fortress, and now I was ready to leave the keys to someone else. The offer came from a boutique artisanal food group 3 months later. They didn't want to change a thing. They just wanted the recipes and the reputation. The number they slid across the table was not just retirement money. It was generational wealth, the kind of money Harper and Madison had hallucinated about, but never earned. I signed the papers with a steady hand, ensuring a clause that kept Leo and the rest of the staff employed with raises. I walked out of that meeting with a check for $4 million and a heart lighter than a soufflé. I didn't buy a mansion. I didn't buy a yacht. I went to a specialty dealership and bought freedom. It was a 40-foot Class A motorhome, a rolling masterpiece of German engineering and American comfort. It had heated marble floors, a king-sized bed, and a windshield that offered a panoramic view of the world. I called it the escape pod. It was everything I needed and nothing I didn't. No lawns to mow, no gutters to clean, and most importantly, no guest rooms for leeches to occupy. But a captain needs a first mate. I stopped at the local animal shelter on my way out of town. I found him in the back corner, an older golden retriever mix with a gray muzzle and eyes that had seen too much disappointment. He looked at me, thumped his tail once, and I knew. I named him Buster. He hopped into the passenger seat of the RV as if he had been waiting for me his whole life. We hit the road on a Tuesday morning, heading west until we ran out of land, and then turning south. The Pacific Coast Highway stretched out before us, a ribbon of asphalt, hugging the cliffs suspended between the redwoods and the deep blue ocean. I rolled the window down, letting the salt air fill the cabin, mixing with the smell of old pine and new leather. I drove past the turnoff that would have taken me back to the city, back to the lawyers, back to the drama of Harper and Madison. I thought about them for a fleeting second. I wondered if they were still arguing in a cramped apartment, blaming the world for their misfortune. But the thought didn't stick. It slid off me like rain on a waxed hood. They were characters in a book I had finished reading. I had closed that cover, and I had no intention of opening it again. Buster barked at a seagull soaring alongside us, snapping me back to the present. I reached over and ruffled his ears. We were heading to Big Sur, then maybe down to Baja. After that, who knew? Maybe Arizona. Maybe the Rockies. The destination didn't matter. The luxury was the motion. I glanced up at the large rearview mirror. Behind me, the road stretched out, disappearing into the fog of the past. There was nothing back there for me anymore. No debts, no obligations, no ghosts. I shifted my gaze forward through the massive windshield, where the sun was breaking through the clouds, illuminating the endless highway. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel and smiled. It was a genuine, easy smile that reached all the way to my eyes. The engine hummed a low, powerful note, a song of departure and arrival all at once. I pressed the accelerator. The road was wide open, and for the first time in my life, I was truly, completely free. The story of Gus and his stepdaughters serves as a powerful reminder that arrogance is the quickest path to ruin. Harper and Madison believed that wealth was their birthright, and that the elderly were obsolete, failing to realize that the true value of the business wasn't the brand name but the man behind the flower. They chased the golden egg while trying to kill the goose. Ultimately, this tale teaches us that true power lies in competence and integrity, not entitlement. Kindness is not weakness, and silence is often just the sound of a strategy being formed. You can steal a legacy, but you cannot steal the skill required to keep it alive. If you enjoyed seeing karma deliver a well-deserved lesson, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more satisfying stories where justice is finally served.